Education is rightfully occupying the centre stage in all discussions around the world, particularly in emerging markets. Further to that, unemployment and skills development has also become a major focus area for most governments in Africa. It's also led to an important discussion on government's responsibilities and the opportunities for the private sector. Is enough being done, though, and how do we fast-track the education agenda on the African continent? That's the hot topic of debate on this edition of Meeting of the Minds, the future of education. We're honoured to have some of the brightest minds in the education sector with us on the panel today. We're also joined by our studio audience. From my far right, Professor Mark E. Smith, Vice-Chancellor, Lancaster University. We're joined also by Professor David Wood, Provost and Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice President, Curtin International. Professor Ihron Rensburg, Vice-Chancellor and Principal, University of Johannesburg. And joining us from our bureau in Cape Town, Dr. Max Price, Vice-Chancellor and Principal, University of Cape Town. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Let's kick off with the challenges that education faces on the African continent. Ihron, perhaps I can start with your thoughts.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Indeed, some significant challenges, but good progress as well. I think for me, the areas of major concern is the research contributions of our continent. It's doubled over the last decade, as shown in a recent report by Elsevier and the World Bank, but it's for a population of 12% currently of the global population. It only produces 1% of the global research output. So major challenges for us there. Good potential, but major problems. And on the other hand, of course, post-school education is important and critical in producing, as you said earlier, the skills for the workplace and for society. And so our big challenge there is both the quantity of supply as well as the quality of supply from our post-school sector.
Max, let's get you to weigh in from Cape Town on this topic.
I think the challenge that the continent faces in higher education is particularly around what's happened over the last 15 years, which you could call a massification. The priority has been to increase access, and across the continent we've seen massive increases in the number of students at university, but that's usually not been matched by an increase in resources and in staffing in particular. And so I think the general view would be that the quality of higher education has declined, particularly undergraduate education, with larger classes and not the kind of personal attention that you often want at a university environment. And so in some ways we've got to play catch up. There has to be a recognition that you can't just put more and more students into a system without the resources, otherwise you'll collapse the system. And I think that that's the huge risk that higher education faces across the continent. It's not, it certainly can be rescued, it can be addressed. There is a shortage of academics, and in particular a shortage of academics with PhDs. Most universities across the continent have well under 50% of their academics with PhDs, and that's a critical factor. So it's not just money resources, it's also growth of adequately qualified staff to populate the teaching positions in universities.
Mark, Lancaster is going some way to rescuing higher education across the continent. Perhaps you can give us a little insight into your foray.
Well, I think the points that have already been made have actually encapsulated some of the problems that are going to occur in a system whereby you have a driver in the need of the society to have people to educate to tertiary level. It's leading, as we've heard already, to a massification, but this is no different to the pressures that are on other systems throughout the world. But what I think you can also see is the way that other universities, the internationalisation, rather than it just being a country by country problem, it's the way the whole system interacts. And the internationalisation of education as a subject in its own right, the undergraduate education. So I think all these things are coming together. Now the project that we're looking at Lancaster is to try and develop a branch within Ghana, in Accra, Ghana. And I think this is one of the ways that capacity will be built within the African sector, because we certainly see advantages from our point of view as a university, and we hope there are advantages for the country as well, and so it could be one of those win-win situations. But I think it's by letting various different players act in a market and by freeing up the kind of competitive edge, as well as governments understanding how they properly resource the systems, that I think you'll end up having a mixed economy that will go some way to addressing the problems that there are within higher education within the African continent.
David, perhaps you stay with that thought on capacity building across the African continent and how international brands can contribute to that process.
And I was going to continue on from what Mark said. I mean, as an outsider, what I see is an amazing rate of change, particularly in areas like the resources sector, that the African continent is in the position where it's going to be exploiting resources, but really it doesn't have the capacity and the capability, I think, to deal with that massive growth. So how do you quite quickly skill up a population to not only enable the development of those resources, but also to benefit the local communities and the incumbent problems that sit beside that. So for me and our work in this country has very much been about capacity building, everything from governance in mining and resources governance through to skills development, which is in many cases fairly light on. And it goes into the vocational sector as well, I suppose. And I'm not really looking, I don't know South Africa as well as I know some other countries in the continent, but there's certainly skill shortages from putting nuts on bolts up to surveying mines and building mines.
Max, let's come back to you on the capacity building and the deployment of resources and specifically harness the funding models that would be optimal. Here I'm going to throw in public-private sector models that could really accelerate the rollout of education across the African continent.
The different countries have had different experience. South Africa, interestingly, has not had a huge growth in private sector universities or private sector funding of higher education. But other countries in Africa have, and I would say that at the moment the verdict is out on how successful it is, and what we particularly need to watch is how it's regulated. So regulation is often anathema to the private sector, but in many countries where there has been unregulated or almost unfettered growth of private sector higher education institutions coming in to meet the need, meet the demand that the countries are experiencing, one's had very variable quality. And in particular at a university level, and I differentiate that from the perhaps vocational training level that Mark and David were just talking about, but at the university level, where a research component in a university is a critical element of what a university delivers. Most private institutions, most private sector contributions have almost no research as part of that, because it's not self-funding, it's not profitable generally. And so they are teaching factories. They are institutions which can be efficient and can certainly be good. There are plenty of examples of outstanding higher education private institutions. But one just has to, I think, go in with eyes wide open and ensure that the regulatory structures that ensure quality are there. The other concern is, of course, that private institutions and public-private partnerships generally depend on students being able to pay, and they often pay fees that are many times higher than the fees of local institutions. That may translate into better quality, better facilities, computer labs, better quality staff. And so, again, not necessarily a bad thing, but one, I think, needs to just be careful about the consequences for societies where there is already a lot of inequality. And one wants to avoid this contributing to that inequality by differentiating between haves and have-nots in access to higher education.
Let's unpack what you've been saying there. Certainly some acknowledgements in terms of nodding happening here in studio. Mark, would you like to pick up?
Yeah, there was a huge amount in what Max just said, and I think if I could highlight two of the key points he made and kind of expand them a little bit, I absolutely think that if you look at inequality, there is a danger that when you get third parties and you get a market environment, that it can exacerbate that. And I think that's then incumbent upon the regulatory environment to actually help normalise that possible inequality exaggeration that can occur. And I certainly am very keen on the university that we're setting up in Ghana actually does charge higher fees than the state system, but both from our own point of view of being socially responsible and wanting to see that we don't increase that inequality, there is a significant roll back in of the fee contribution to allow people who cannot afford to come. And that's actually at the core actually of what we're about as a university back in the UK. We have very good social inclusiveness figures for a university of our quality back in the UK, and we're very proud of our record, and that would be want to be one of the bedrocks that we actually see happening in any university we set up overseas. So it's about playing that socially responsible role. The second point I think that was made is also that it's important that you asked the student to understand the type of university they want to go to. So for example, a university that's worth its name really should have research as a key element of it. And so the distinction between a teaching factory and a university that is offering the broad experience to make sure that its staff are educated to the highest possible level, preferably PhD level, but also that those staff themselves are engaging in scholarship at least, but also hopefully research that's informing their teaching, I think is important to the overall experience. So those things must be bedrocks of a quality university, and that will in itself then help to encourage the quality of the education of the people coming out and help to solve some of the problems that were articulated in our opening answers.
David?
Just to pick up on what Mark was saying, my university runs, and I suppose I manage them, I run 3 branch campuses and a number of partnerships in different parts of the world. One of the things that they do enable is charging lower fees. So a student can go to one of our campuses at about half the price of going to a campus in Australia, but they are still expensive. We also have a number of public-private partnerships or partnerships with our university. Mine is a public organisation but has the capacity to build private partnerships. And we have a number of partnerships where our courses are offered, if you like, in a franchise model, which may seem a bit concerning, but just in coming back to the earlier point about quality, Australian universities offering programs offshore have to comply with Australian quality conditions. So it's quite interesting that in fact with our branch campuses they're covered by our own quality assurance mechanisms as well as local quality assurance mechanisms, and I rep ISO 9001 accreditation over that as well. So I think you can keep the quality. I think the fees are an issue, but I think to come back to the fundamental point that a university is something where it's a place that teaches, it does research, and it has a community responsibility. So I think it is a bit of a battle to wrap all those things up together. I have one of my branch campuses is a partnership with a state government, and that's been very easy to put research programs in place. So that's a partnership between an Australian university and a state government in Malaysia. The programs that we run as public-private partnerships, research isn't part of the funding formula. So you have to drive that yourself. It becomes your own cost. Yeah.
Ihron, I want to get your thoughts on regulation, as Max touched on having the right regulatory structure, but I want to come back to the issue, David, that you've just touched on, and that is one of transferability, because I know from a Lancaster perspective, whether you are based in your headquarters or in an offshore campus, you can transfer between those two operations as a student.
Yeah.
That would be a differentiator.
Yeah, the key thing is that the whole curriculum is the same whether it's being delivered in Ghana or whether it's being delivered in the UK. And just as in Australia, we are regulated for our offshore operations by both the internal quality control mechanisms of whatever country you're operating, plus in the UK's case, the Quality Assurance Agency, the QAA. And so therefore it's kind of almost a double jeopardy, which is a good thing. I mean, I think we should be quality assured by both agencies, and it keeps us on our toes, so I think that's a good thing. The other thing about the transferability, because it's the same curriculum, actually one of my longer term dreams is to use these partnerships with countries such as Ghana, is to actually get more UK students to take part of their undergraduate education in another country. Now, there's always been year abroad or semester abroad type activities, but from a UK point of view, not enough students are getting this wider international experience. And I think because of transferability, it will be much easier because the same curriculum, effectively the same examination processes, this will become much more readily transferable and transparent. And therefore, I'm very much hoping that this will, in the medium term, will get more UK students to come and see the other fantastic places there are in the world.
Ihron, coming back to the regulatory side of things.
Like Max, I'm cautious. Let me explain my problem. So, given the price that our peer institutions are charging for admission and for programs, we're never going to be able to widen the base of participation in the university or post-school system in South Africa. So it's great for Lancaster and Curtin and the others to make their contribution as they are making, but I think it's fair to say that given the price that they are asking, and I'm less bothered, to be fair, about the accreditation and regulation issues in respect of these top-tier institutions that they are. I'm less bothered about that, to be honest. I think we should be concerned about that broad base that Max has referred to of post-school institutions that are mushrooming across the capitals of Ghana, Nigeria, and into Kenya. Those are the three big markets where there's massive growth of these unregulated degree factories or diploma factories. And I think that's our issue. So on internationalization, on international campuses making their mark on the continent, that's fantastic. I think that that's not going to broaden the base. The participation rate in university education on the continent is 8%. It's already an elite system as we speak. Our challenge is to broaden that base, and we're not going to be able to broaden it with private institutions or private pricing. We're going to have to look for alternative models. And my sense is that we've got about 8, 10 strong university brands on the continent. And I think that those strong brands need to find time to get together and to have conversations about how they're going to expand through online learning possibilities, use their brands to leverage broadened participation on the continent. I think that's the big challenge that faces us.
Max, Ihron tabling a solution there. What do you think of collaboration between potentially the 8 top brands in education across the continent, and certainly a push into online education, collaboration in the greater sense?
Again, lots of points raised. I probably want to put a bit of distance between my position and Ihron's, in that I think that I agree with Ihron that the danger is the almost fly-by-night private institutions where there's poor quality, just profiteering. And I think it's important to draw a very clear distinction between those, as Ihron did, but to emphasize that I think there's a real role for good brand international universities that are willing to come into the continent and set up institutions, but I think they have to address the cost access. And it sounds like some might be through scholarships or through social responsibility opportunities. That itself also needs to be transparent. They're clearly not going to come into foreign territories if they can't at least break even, because they're public institutions. They're not going to subsidize education elsewhere. But I think that there's a risk, as they currently function, that they sort of skim off an elite or a cream and actually there's the possibility of sometimes doing harm to the remaining very good public local institutions, the flagship institutions, unless there is some quite good collaboration. On the question of online learning, there's undoubtedly a place for that. There are going to be students who are working and can't afford to study full time. There are going to be students who are located in places where there is no university, and they would have to travel far and would have to spend a lot more money to be in residence and to live in another city. But I don't think it's that the two are the one substitutes for the other, and that for me, I would want to ensure that governments are not let off the hook of expanding residential university accommodation by thinking that there's an easy option through online education. The two both have to develop. Online can help, but I think that the core is to grow the residential capacity. And collaborating across the continent between the universities, of course, that's something we should do. It's enormously difficult, even within South Africa, where we don't have sufficient access to university level. The kind of collaboration that can result in expansion is difficult. It's something to deal with. But it's just one part of the solution.
Max, I want to pause on that collaboration and get David to come in with his thoughts there on this model that's being proposed by Ihron. We'll come back to the online learning because I think that deserves some more time as a discussion point and how it can transform the future of education in Africa.
I was actually going to go in a different direction.
Well, take me where you want to go, but do you like this collaborative model or not?
No, I do, but I went to an interesting meeting of COMESA and the West Australian government in February in Zambia, and the West Australian government was offering to help African nations in the development of their resources. I mean, there are countries in this continent that are going to amass enormous wealth over the next 10 or 20 years. And of course, the interesting thing for me is what return are those nations going to get from resource exploitation, and are they going to preference putting that money into education? If you look at some very highly developed economies, and I don't put Australia in amongst them for education spending, but there are some very, very successful countries in the world that where their future strengths are really very much vested in their contribution or the contribution to the education resources of their countries. So I suppose what I would hope is that as African countries gain wealth and gain wealth from resources, that those countries will get a return from resource exploitation that's commensurate with the effort, and that they'll put a really...
I think perhaps another discussion for another day in terms of funding education out of resources on the African continent.
I'm getting more just at the funding of education more broadly.
Let's move forward with the online discussion at this point. And you look at a farmer potentially in Zimbabwe. He can't get a vet out to see his cattle, and he needs to diagnose those cattle. It's possible on a mobile device. Somebody can send him the relevant information and he can do a mini course in diagnosing his cattle. Is that the future of education?
Well, I think that online, I mean, there are various contexts in which online education will play a role, but I don't think it should be overemphasised as a panacea for all of the problems. I mean, you've already heard that the kind of social contact, the face-to-face value of education, the kind of socialisation of the individual as a student within a broader framework, I think are all crucial elements of higher education. However, and I'm probably the last person to talk about this, given that the scales of the countries we're talking about here, South Africa, Australia, there are obviously rural areas which are very, very far removed from their ability to go. That's not true. Of course, in the UK, we're a geographically very small country by comparison. But nevertheless, there will be elements, and I think the things that you see with developments of online, the so-called, for example, MOOCs are kind of the flavour of the month, the massive online open courses, are all going to be supplements to the core delivery of the curriculum through relatively traditional methods. I mean, one of the stories that I kind of enjoyed most was that, of course, some universities are very ancient indeed, and of course, when the book came along, that was the threat to the universities of 500 or 600 years ago, that the book would change. They seem to survive that, and I think universities in the form they are now, developing and adapting what the new online brings to them, making their offering even better. But the core idea of what a university is, I think, will fundamentally not change because of it.
Ihron?
Just a thought for us to consider. So, if the participation rate on the continent sits at 8%, after 5 decades of independence, and we know, of course, that there were various policy decisions of the World Bank that influenced this poor outcome that we have now. And so the question, therefore, that we challenge to answer is, are we going to be able to grow that participation to 70–80% participation that we have in developed nations? We're not going to be able, I have to conclude, that we're not going to be able to do that. And therefore, I'm suggesting that we have to look closely at this issue, not necessarily whole qualifications. I think you've got an important idea there. Not necessarily entire whole qualifications offered online, but potentially this offers a way forward, even if it's 2 or 3 modules that make sense together for a university with a strong brand to be able to offer, perhaps again on a limited basis, not massive online offering where 100,000 enroll for a program, and it becomes really a waste of time of everybody concerned. So that's where I'm coming from, deep concern that we have essentially an elite university system, that we're not going to break its elitism to real massification until we find solutions.
Max, how are you delivering on the online side of things down in Cape Town? How is it effectively changing your model? And I talk here with caution because, again, we've got to look at the level of broadband penetration across the African continent. That, obviously, we need to get right before we can transform the education agenda. But back to the point on how you are changing to take into account online learning.
Yeah, well, your point about broadband is certainly right, but it must be said that most of the big cities at the coast are now connected, and most of the universities within those cities are connected. So one of the early starting points, perhaps, is for strong universities to be able to strengthen those many universities we were talking about, which just don't have the extent of faculty, the overcrowding we talked about, the underskilling of faculty. And so one of the ways in which we would like to play a role, and are starting to, is by developing courses which are appropriate to the African continent, and even take something like statistics, which you might assume would be the same course whether developed by MIT or Stanford or Lancaster or the University of Cape Town. But actually, if you've had experience with students who are second language English, students who've got a certain schooling which is often disadvantaged, doesn't have the same A-level maths, for example, coming into university, but also can tailor it so that the kinds of examples and case studies you use are relevant to the African experiences or the cases, the examples that students in Tanzania or Zambia will encounter. You can develop a really high-quality statistics course which can be delivered online with tutorial support in the face-to-face environment. And so you could offer a course, or a university like Cape Town could offer a course in partnership with and into the established universities of the continent, which would help raise the quality where it's necessary. Of course, I don't want to be paternalistic and assume the quality isn't good everywhere. There are islands of excellence, but could help raise the quality, expand the capacity for that teaching. So I think that's the first way in which one can engage. The second, I think, and the actual online courses and online qualifications, I think for the next 5 to 10 years will largely be at postgraduate level, because there's now a lot of evidence that to really benefit from and take advantage of an online course at a university level, you need to have some university study experience. It's a discipline, it's an approach to learning which is completely different from school, and one needs to mature into it to some extent. The successful MOOCs and other successful online courses have largely, the people who complete are largely people who already have a degree or are mid-career and are retooling for a very specific purpose. So our initiatives into online learning across the continent, across Africa, will be in the field of what we call postgraduate diplomas for people who have a degree and want to now do a postgraduate qualification in marketing, in project management, in some particular area, perhaps ecology or environmental management. That's where I think people can really benefit, because they don't have to go into a residential environment. They've already had that experience. They know how to use the systems, they can use the resources. And often
Max,
they'll be at
I'm
work,
just mindful
and so
of time.
afford.
I'm going to come back quickly to David on that point.
I'll just pick up on a couple of those points that Max made. I sit on the board of Open Universities Australia, which is an interesting organisation. It's not like Open Universities in the UK. It's owned by 7 universities, and it offers single units. So anyone can go in and study a unit. It doesn't have the entry requirements of a university. And when someone successfully studied 3 or 4 units, they can then go into a university. So you've still got to have the universities sitting behind it, and they pick up a degree. The most popular course that we run is an undergraduate course in education, and that would be very interesting for Africa. It's very well run. We've got, I think, 4 times the number of students studying off campus that we have on campus, but that would be a way that you could really address some of the skills shortages in the African continent. One thing that we've noticed is the universities have been enabled to take more students. The numbers, and as we get more private providers coming into the system, the Open Universities Australia enrolments are going down. But we've also bought a number of training institutes, so we run a number of other businesses, if you like, that are online businesses, and they're gaining strength, including some of the postgraduate studies. So it can do wonderful things, and certainly in Australia with those education courses, a lot of those people are picking them up who live in regional centres. So they're living in centres where there isn't a university. Statistically, the bulk of students studying at Open Universities Australia across the whole band of courses live in metropolitan areas.
On that point, we're going to take a quick commercial break. Stay tuned for more Meeting of the Minds, the Future of Education, when we come back. Welcome back to Meeting of the Minds, the Future of Education. We are, of course, coming to you from our studio in Johannesburg, South Africa, where we've brought together the brightest minds in international academia to share their views on the state and future of education on the African continent. Max, I'm going to throw it back down to you in Cape Town. Before we went to the break, we touched on research in premier universities and the importance of that across the African continent. Perhaps you can pick up on that discussion point.
I think one of the mistakes that's been made in national policies on higher education is to believe that every university in the country can be elevated to being a serious research-intensive university. It's a denial of the merits and need for differentiation. Some universities largely undergraduate, some a much stronger focus on postgraduate, and some strong focus on research. And clearly there's not going to be enough money for many universities in every country to be research intensive. Countries like China, Japan, Taiwan, Germany, France, across the world have chosen to focus, to select a small number of universities, sometimes a handful, sometimes 5 or 9 in the case of China to start with. That will get the additional resources required to become globally competitive research universities. And I think that that's what Africa needs to do too, the countries and the continent. And there isn't such a policy yet, and there isn't such a funding strategy. It's not politically comfortable. In a country like Nigeria, you've got 36 states. Every state wants to have its own premier university, but Nigeria can probably afford 3 or 4. And it needs to make the hard choices to do so.
Mark? Weigh in on the hard choices that need to be made here.
Yeah, I mean, listening to that conversation, there's a lot of kind of resonance around the world about that, because there's a key discussion at the moment is how many really world-class research-intensive universities can any country afford, let alone the ones that you're looking at here. I mean, in the United States, for example, which is clearly the Premier League for universities, they clearly have too many research-intensive universities. The UK does. The problem comes in how do you make the hard choices, because in a way it then becomes the difference between top-down driven government policy and the ability of universities to become what they want, because they are autonomous organisations. At least in the UK they are autonomous organisations. So therefore it's very difficult for the government to dictate policy as to what type of university you should become. But I absolutely agree with the key thesis of what Max was saying, that that research-intensive universities are very expensive. There does need to be an agreement with a government about how many they can really afford, and then some mechanism to allowing that to be fair. And I think that's a very difficult choice to make, but one that is necessary.
Let's move on to broad participation in higher education, and at the heart of that is the funding. Ihron.
Just allow me, if you don't mind, just a quick comment. I mean, what Max says sounds all good, but put it in a South African context. And I don't want to get into domestic politics because of the historic nature of the evolution of our institutions. I would go a different way, or shall I say an additional way, which is to say that the Square Kilometre Array Initiative or project in South Africa, that's the way to go. Africa needs to harvest significant global research initiatives, such as the SKA initiative in South Africa, which brings in 8 or 9 African countries, and of course Australia, right, and to some extent New Zealand. And there is an example of how we need to go forward to build the base of Africa's research capability.
Well, let's park the funding. Let's go, because David has to come in here.
No, well,
he's almost nodding his head off.
Well, because my university is the Australian end. I mean, we've built the first bit of the Square Kilometre Array, and I think what that demonstrates is the absolute power of collaboration. Every country around the world will have policy shifts around education. So in Australia at the moment, we're seeing a decline in funding in the Australian Research Council. We're seeing the medical research being increased, so there'll be more medical research. But the only way we'll survive, if you like, in fundamental research in science is to form partnerships. Now, Mark's sitting in the middle of the European Union, where there's an enormous amount of funding for fundamental research at the moment. But it is those partnerships, and that's in fact what my university is doing in Africa. We certainly recruit some students here, but we're very interested in the number of AusAid-funded research scholars might come from here, but also we're setting up research partnerships and research alliances with African universities to bolster that strength. I do also have just one slight problem with what Max was saying, is that I think universities have to do some research. I think exposing students in a university to staff who do no research at all would be really troubling to me. It may be in the area of education, but collaboration to me is the future.
Max, this debate is taking a life of its own. We've got to give you right to respond there, sir.
No, it's fine. I think you've covered the various positions. We're not going to settle the issue.
We're going to open to the audience. Coming back to that funding question, you're not off the hook. Would you like to go ahead with your question, sir?
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Kasi Tole. I'm from Wits University. My first query is on the issue of access to education, especially within the South African context. I think 8% is still a bit too low, but my broader question is on the matter of what is it that we are doing with that 8%, because what I see is that even with those students that we do get into the system, the graduation rates that we're actually producing as a country are still way too low. So what you're finding is that the people that are form part of that 8% are taking up a bulk of the funding because they're stuck within the system. And have universities done enough to actually address those throughput issues? And I think also, if you look at the question of access, if access is not coupled with a very high opportunity for success, it probably isn't access in the first place.
David, you want to offer a response there?
Oh, look, in terms of the number of students in universities, I mean, I come from a country which I think, we've just lost a leader to Australia last week who, in fact, put in place free education for our country, which was a phenomenal era in Australian history, but it was unsustainable. And what was put in place was a system where university students also contribute to the cost of their education through their taxes. So they get a free education while they're studying, and that's been tremendous in Australia for open access, because people who haven't got the ready cash to go to university can still go, and they get scholarships to support them. But I think it's very difficult, unless you're Norway with the second largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, it's very hard to continue to get high participation rates and have countries completely fund it. Mark and I were talking just before about the extent of those debts that people build, but I think, at some stage you have to look at people contributing to the cost of education.
Max, would you like to offer some thoughts here?
I suppose just because this is on public record, it should be said that in South Africa the rate is 18%, not 8%, and that. But I agree that there's a significant problem because the pass rates, the completion rates, are way lower than they should be. Of course, the fundamental problem is in the school system, not in the university system. But the universities can't sit and wait for another 20 years for the schools to be fixed. So we end up spending a lot of resources with bridging programs, extended degrees, smaller classes with extra tutors and tutorials, writing programs. And that's what we recognize that South African universities know they have to do that in order to improve the success rates and the throughput rates. So I acknowledge it's a huge problem. I don't think the universities are the cause of it, but we are part of the solution.
Ihron, a quick comment before we move to our next question.
Just again, as a matter of public record, the 8% refers to a Pan-African participation rate, whereas 18 is South African. So I deliberately focused on the Pan-African picture. At the University of Johannesburg, on this very difficult topic, we've built up an extensive tutor system. 2,600 tutors are working with our undergrad students day in, day out. That's the best we can do, and we are beginning to see good results coming through.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric Stillerman. I represent London School of Business, South Africa. We provide tuition for University of London international programs in South Africa at the degree level. And on the diploma level, the Association of Business Executives, which is also a UK institution, I think they've got about 40 or 50,000 students worldwide, including about 20 or 30,000 students throughout Africa. My question really is addressing the challenges and more to the future, not so much to the past model of elitist education, but as Ihron was putting forward the challenge of massification, we really need win-win solutions where we can reach the 80% and we can empower people with more skills. And I'd offer two suggestions along those lines. One is that we need to make a stronger linkage between secondary education, the high school system, and university education. And secondly, with industry, in terms of the practical skills that are required for work-related occupations and the working environment, rather than a classical, theoretically based education. And that should be the trend, combined, of course, with online. So I'm looking for win-win solutions, not for more problems. Thanks very much.
You clearly stand wrapped over the knuckles. Solutions, gentlemen. We want no more challenges when it comes to education on the African continent. Thank you very much for tabling those solutions. Mark, let's get your thoughts.
Just a couple of things there. I mean, I think if you look at the way university education has changed over the last 20 plus years, the embedding of the curriculum of other skills much more broadly than the kind of core academic disciplines, I think has changed rapidly. So when I go around classes in different years and I see how erudite and confident students are when I compare them to what they were like 20 years ago, I think this broader skill set is something that's being inculcated within many of our curricula. The other thing is to think about what is it that businesses really want. And in fact, it comes back to the very discussion we're having here, because the ability to work internationally, the ability to work in multinational settings because of the consequences of globalization, I think is one of the key things that education provides. And I think both with their ability to study abroad, but I'm sure all of the universities represented here are themselves multicultural kind of environments in their own right. And I think that's absolutely a crucial skill that I think we are getting right. I'm not saying we can't do better, we've got to do better, but nevertheless, I think and you also look at the employability rates of students coming out of universities. For most good universities, the employability rates are pretty high. So they must be doing something right.
We salute you for the things that you are doing right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Shelima. I'm a consultant. I'm interested in the fact that with the changing student profiles in higher education, it might be pointing to the obsolescence of the curriculum, assessment strategies, and faculty expertise. What are universities doing about this in order to address the quality of education?
Ihron?
Thanks, Bronwyn. I think it's an excellent question because evidently there is, certainly in the South African and the broader Southern African context, there's a widening gap that we are putting great effort into closing, but certainly there is a gap between the new generation or first generation young people who come into our universities. And of course the older generation academics who had been schooled to serve a different kind of audience. I have regular debates and conversations in the Senate of the university with the professors, with the heads of departments, and I can say that 5, 6 years in, we have made good progress on that conversation, and it's precisely for that reason that many of us are investing considerably in additional tutorial support. We are investing in programs directed also at our academics to get them to understand this shift in the student population that they're experiencing. So yes, there is this gap, but many of us are putting in great effort to close this gap between the incoming generation, first generations, who really first time in university, no experience in the family, and not patronizingly, but supportively, to enable them to flourish in the university is an absolute commitment that all of us, certainly I know the 4 universities that are gathered here, all 4 of us are deeply committed to securing a fantastic and a flourishing experience, in particular for first generation university entrants.
Max, I don't think any discussion on education is complete without the STEM skilling discussion. I've just come back from Tianjin in China for the World Economic Forum, where I hosted a debate on STEM skilling. That's obviously science, technology, engineering and maths. How seriously are we looking at investment in this arena specifically on the African continent, given the global focus on STEM skills?
I have to say I can't speak about the continent. I don't really know enough about that. But with respect to South Africa, at the university level, it's driven largely through an agreement that each university makes with the Department of Higher Education about what numbers of students they'll enroll in different kinds of disciplines. And so the funding we get is linked to meeting that commitment. And I think in that regard that the Department of Higher Education is steering it appropriately. In our environment, well over 40% of our students are in the STEM disciplines. People are often unclear about whether health sciences and life sciences should be included in that. Business is also clearly a major area, business and commerce, and that's about another 30%. And so there's 30% still humanities, social sciences, law, and those are equally important. So at least in some of the universities, I think the balance is appropriate. But perhaps where the real problem is the one that was mentioned by some of the other speakers, and that is the focus might be too much on higher education, by which I mean universities, and not enough on the vocational training, artisanal training, technical skills. And quite often when
Max,
people
I'm going to have to jump in here, and just again cognizant of time, we've got one more question from the audience. Thank you very much.
My name is Terence Murasiki. I think my question really revolves around the fact that we have focused quite a lot on higher education, university education, but I think it's a bit too late for most people, because I think most education begins at a basic level. What strategies can we adopt at a basic level that allow children who wouldn't have a chance to actually have an opportunity because of the effectiveness of that system? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to get that incorporated in closing comments, because I'm going to task you all with solutions to the problems that we're facing when it comes to education on the African continent. I think we'll move to that now. So you have all been mandated with coming up with the appropriate funding model. You thought you were off the hook. The appropriate funding model for massification of education across the African continent. What would you like to see written in those rules? In fact, you are the writer of those rules. So, Ihron, can I start with you?
I'm fine to kick off. Just to give you a heads up, South Africa's spend on university education sits at less than 1% of GDP. Cuba sits at 4.8%. I just want to give, for that matter, in the region, if we go to Botswana, the spending is close to 2%. Zimbabwe is close to 2% of GDP. And so if one just scans the expenditure across the region on university education, there's a fundamental mismatch again. And therefore, what I would want to see, precisely as has been pointed out by David, is to see the returns on these on resources, seeing that being invested into basic education and into university education. So on the basic education, I think that our big job is to play the role that we can at the University of Johannesburg. The role that we play is we work with 800 grade 10, 11 and 12 kids, so last 3 years of high school, and we work with them on our Soweto campus every Friday and during the course of the week, but especially Fridays they take over that campus and we require them to wear their uniform so that we can see them. And so they're in our labs, labs set aside precisely for maths and science, engineering and technology to enable them to have a head start. If I could make a last quick comment, and that is the most disappointing thing about the last 10 years in respect of university research output or Africa's research output is the fact that, wonderful, yes, almost 60% of our research output is in the health sciences. That's great. The trouble is in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, our research output as a continent is only sitting at about 20–22%. And so both on the input side, we've got work to do, as well as on the research side.
Max, let's get your concluding comments, sir.
I think I'll make my comments more about the continent than about South Africa. And I think that one of the ways in which universities on the continent are hamstrung is through the extent of government interference. And that interference, for example, extends to the salaries you can pay, the fees you can charge students, the appointment of staff sometimes. And I think for universities in the continent to unleash their potential, they need to have significantly more autonomy. To the credit of the South African higher education system, we do have that autonomy here. And it's because, for example, one can charge higher fees, and this relates to the example from Australia, which I agree with completely. Because you can charge higher fees, you can generate an income which when the government doesn't provide it, and you can in fact cross-subsidize other students with that income, as well as providing higher quality. We're in a very competitive world, competing for top academics. If we're going to be required to pay salaries which are well below the salaries of universities elsewhere in the continent and outside, we're not going to be able to attract the top staff and keep them. We're not going to be able to persuade them to work on research rather than do consultancy work to supplement their income and then not do research. So I think that at the university, at the continent level, it's about universities being given more autonomy to manage themselves.
David?
Well, I think, as I said before, it's about the amount of money you can spend. It's the point that Ihron raises, and whether it comes out of the public purse or partly out of the private purse, I think it's an irrefutable thing that you just got to spend money on education and innovation. So it's not just spending it on the universities churning out graduates, it's the power of innovation in a country. So, you know, our scientific organisation invented Wi-Fi. That scientific organisation can pay for itself in a sense because it had the money to be innovative. But the other point that I'd go back to, I think, and it's something that always strikes me when I'm on the African continent, is that need for training at the most fundamental level. And it's about maternal and infant health. It's about putting nuts on bolts. It's about digging mines safely. And having a system, a policy environment as we have in Australia, and I'm not lauding Australia for it, but we have a thing called the Australian Qualification Framework, which links school education through vet education through universities, so that someone who does start with basic training can, if they wish, aspire to be a PhD.
Mark?
Yeah, so the question was, if we were given the power to solve the funding power.
You have been given the power.
I'm going to disappoint you by kind of abrogating that responsibility, but what I would say is absolutely there are key principles, and those key principles are about having a grown-up debate about what the right level is for the right level of education for the outcomes, and then having a proper debate about where the balance becomes between private good and public good, because I think that in its way then says how you should have a mixed economy. So there isn't it isn't that the state should fund everything, it isn't that the student should fund everything, it's a complex mixture which requires a wide-ranging debate with both the universities, the government and the people who take advantage of education, the student. And I think a broad debate amongst those three actors, I think, is hugely important to come out with the right answer. And I want to say one final thing, which was at the core of the question that we were just asked at the end there. In the UK, there is, I think this is quite a shame, really, that your outcomes of life are still determined by the education you receive at both the primary and the secondary level. The universities do what they can to correct it, but it's until those systems are of the highest possible quality that you then get the best possible social mobility within any system. So it's about funding the whole education system, not just the higher education system, and understanding how it all fits together.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for that robust debate. On that note, we've come to the end of Meeting of the Minds, the Future of Education. I'd like to borrow from the late Nelson Mandela, who famously said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. Thank you to our distinguished panel for sharing their insights. Also to our studio audience, thank you for your time. On behalf of all of us at CNBC Africa, goodbye and thank you for watching.